This week, 99 Luftballons. Twitter has conspiracy theories. No, say it isn't so. Hackers steal billions and don't get caught. Imagine that. Iowa election apps secured by, you guessed it, obscurity. And the top 24 passwords found on the dark web. All this and Jason Wood today on Security Weekly News.
This is Security Weekly. For security professionals, by security professionals.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
It's the show that keeps you up to date on the latest security news twice a week. Your trusted source for accurate security information and expert analysis. It's time for Security Weekly News. Make sure your team is prepared to fight off the latest cybersecurity threat. IT Pro TV is the resource to keep you and your IT team skills up to date. You can stream IT Pro TV courses live and on demand, so there's no need to send staff to off-site training. Team subscriptions include Pro Portal, so managers have full control over your team's training schedule. Go to itpro.tv/hack-naked and use the code HN30 to try it free for 7 days and receive 30% off your monthly membership. As technology continues to evolve and expand, so have the countless ways our critical systems can be put in jeopardy. Ransomware attacks, misconfiguration, user error, and malicious threat actors, to name a few. As IT infrastructures continue to grow and diversify, how do you ensure stable security? Core Security, a help systems company, provides an analytics-driven, layered approach to security with a portfolio that enables both proactive and reactive responses. With Core Security, you can reduce risk by limiting access, detect upcoming and active threats, test for security weaknesses, and efficiently monitor data for actionable insights. To learn more, visit securityweekly.com/core security.
Welcome to the news for the week of 2 February 2020. I'm your host, Doug White. Let's get right to the news. Well, the first event of the election season, the Iowa caucuses, happened last night. The application that is used by various precincts to report votes was being held in a state of secrecy, according to this article, as apparently election officials believe that security through obscurity is always a good idea. Now, it's been my observation that this doesn't usually work, and somebody finds out what it is and how it works, or even worse, what really happened was no one knows what it is or how it works, and it's never been tested. I personally think it would be better to build a solid tool that is secure and put it out there and let people try it and tell me what's wrong with it and then maybe put it into practice. But hey, that was what they decided to do. That was my position when I wrote that part of the story yesterday. But then what really happened? Well, so this next story was chaos in a political campaign, multiple candidates claiming victory, a pale rider comes from afar, who knows? But a new mobile app was put in place to be used at the Iowa caucuses, which is a quaint practice if you're not familiar with it. They basically have a town meeting for like 1 million people or something. There was 1,700 different caucuses going on. The app ended up being blamed for causing delays in reporting the results from all these different caucus meetings. Now, different stories had different things to say about this. So it was all very confusing. But glitches was a word that was used. I always like to see that because that's one of those really informative words. But apparently glitches was announced as the cause for the app not working properly. The app went on to be described as a mess by other people. This app was written by a DC, I love the name of this company, a DC company called Shadow Inc. I always like to trust my election results to people that are called things like Shadow, Evil Incorporated, that kind of thing. But basically, Shadow Inc. is a tech division of a nonprofit progressive digital strategy firm called Acronym. I mean, does that not sound suspicious to anybody except me? I don't know. Acronym? Shadow? Who could this be? Anyway, apparently the app was hastily conceived. No training was provided to the election officials. It was just one of those deals where we've all seen where they went, download this onto your phone and hit go. And I guess, my guess is in that whole process, they didn't do a lot of testing at all. But sure sounds fun to me. Yeah, it's not the Illuminati. I don't think so. The Illuminati always run their conspiracies a lot cleaner than this. But regardless of that, it doesn't appear that all these giant headlines you saw this morning, it doesn't appear that there was an exploit or a 0-day or any kind of a compromise as much as it was just a bad app. basically, I always choose to roll out new products, that's been held in secret and never been reviewed by anybody on the world stage on opening day of the election season. What could go wrong? But everybody basically allowed all the political contestants to claim they won. So pretty much everybody, even people that had no chance of winning, claimed they won, but nobody's still sure. At least when I got here, I hadn't looked at the news since this morning. So currently, we still don't know, and everybody moved on to New Hampshire, and so what? But anyway, maybe next time they're going to listen to me, they're going to run a bug bounty or something like that. But hey, along those same lines, Russian language cyber forums often have forum-wide cash prize competitions, and this is nothing new, of course. We call these bug bounties, but a lot of these were being run apparently in Russia by the Russian mob. So it is a type of bug bounty program, but a lot of these high dollar prizes like $15,000 seem to be being funded by various Russian crews associated with organized crime, like Sodina Kibi, which is part of our evil, the our evil ransomware team. So maybe the Russian mob will volunteer to run a bug bounty program on the apps that are being used in U.S. elections as we approach, the real crux of election season. I don't know. That led me to the next story, which basically was a study being done by Dark Reading, where they found that 61% of businesses had AppSec concerns. And because of those AppSec concerns, they had changed applications. So they asked people, do you worry about security of things you're using? And they said, and 61% of them said yes. And a lot of these businesses didn't just change applications. They abandoned the commercial application and moved to open source or home-rolled tools, which has its own set of interesting problems. But basically, this seems to be a growing concern among all of us. And I personally think it's been a growing concern forever, because when you deal with commercial applications, and Apple users know this better than anybody, when the company won't reveal how things work or let you have access to it and let you repair your own things, well, you're kind of at their mercy. And proprietary applications have always been like this. So if you bought a game, you bought an application to use at work or whatever, you basically were stuck with whatever they did. And a similar story along those lines, then Mediatronic, who makes implantable medical devices, that's a creepy way to put that to me, but sticking it in somewhere, reported that they had finally patched vulnerabilities in some of their devices, along with a disclaimer that they had no knowledge of any issues that had ever occurred as a result of these vulnerabilities, which I guess is true. But this was almost a year after the vulnerability was originally flagged. And that's the kind of thing, criticism of Huawei with chipsets that have firmware and on and on and on and on, ends up being, I think, what drives companies to start talking about open source and or rolling their own application or forking apps out of open source stuff. Now, personally, I've dealt with this a long time, and I will tell you that there's pluses and minuses on both sides of the coin. But at least with the homegrown apps, despite all the cost associated with supporting those apps and the ability of your organization to support it, you at least have access to the source code. And so if it's broken, you can fix it. Now, not everybody wants to do that. So you may want to think carefully before you jump off the commercial bandwagon and onto other bandwagons. But I do like that open source world. Speaking of misinformation in the election, well, Twitter, long known as a bastion of not having any conspiracy theories and crazy stuff on it, but Twitter permanently banned Zero Hedge this week. Zero Hedge's CEO is listed as the name Tyler Durden. If you're not familiar with Tyler Durden, that is the imaginary protagonist of the movie Fight Club. Great movie, by the way, if you've never seen it. But they list their founder's username as Tyler Durden. Basically, they claimed that the financial blog had violated Twitter policy because they basically, Zero Hedge published a conspiracy theory about a Chinese scientist being responsible for the coronavirus. All that, okay, that's one thing. So there have been a lot of those kind of things floating around. Then they proceeded to dox the guy. And not only did they dox this poor guy who, didn't invent the coronavirus, come on, but they invited their readers to pay him a visit. This sounded to me a lot like high-tech swatting stuff, but apparently Zero Hedge has made a lot of these kind of posts in the past. And, so a hedge fund blog that is out there. Speaking of big money, Facebook agreed to pay around $500 million in a class action suit brought claiming that the Big F violated Illinois law by inappropriate data collection for facial recognition. They had tried to press this all the way to the Supreme Court, but the U.S. Supreme Court refused to hear the appeal in the case over biometric privacy. So, unfortunately for Facebook, they'll have to shell out the cash. And this was a settlement, so they decided to give up, I guess, at that point. Along the same lines of $1 billion, way back in 2016, hackers stole around $1 billion from a Bangladesh bank, and they took the money out of the reserves at the New York Fed. Now, this was a really interesting case to me because I actually used to work at the Fed, not the New York Fed, but I worked at a Fed. And I thought it was a very interesting case. It was one of the largest heists ever. The money all pretty much evaporated into the Philippines, into casino accounts. It would just poof, it was all gone. And even today, it's still an outstanding case as to exactly who did this. But this week, a report from Mandiant was released talking about how this breach worked. Basically, they documented they used this thing called the SWIFT messaging network, which is the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunications, if you wanted to know why it had an acronym. And basically what SWIFT does is it allows for supposedly secure and standardized transfers between banks. So when banks want to take money from one and put it in another, they can transfer it through the Fed using the SWIFT system. And, that's supposedly a secure electronic transaction. But the $951 million was transferred out using SWIFT. So this was, of course, a big blow to the Fed. But was it the problem of SWIFT or was it something else? Well, this report basically tied all this together. Apparently, Bangladesh Bank back in 2015, which before the attack actually happened, implemented a new system called the Real-Time Gross Settlement System, or RTGS. The banking industry could probably use some marketing people to give them better names, but the RTGS settlement system was bolted onto Bangladesh Bank to process local transactions into the overall system. Well, through this third-party system, the hackers were able to deploy malware into the SWIFT system, which allowed them to send electronic messages, and I don't mean emails, but they were able to send bank messages to the New York Fed. The malware was basically capturing user IDs and passwords. So this is like, we had Doug Song on Security Weekly 2 weeks ago. The author of DSNIF. So this is a similar kind of operation. And they were able to get these passwords. According to the report, the malware was advanced, which it may have had to be to extract all this information from this SWIFT secure system. And it was custom designed just to attack SWIFT servers. Once all that was in place, the hackers, whoever they were able to transfer all the money out. And some of the transactions did fail because they misspelled words like foundation was spelled as fundation, which maybe they were just, really positive, ebullient kind of hackers. But ultimately, a lot of blame for this came out. The belief is still that this may well have been North Korea. That's talked about in the report, but it's still not 100% clear exactly who did this. So the Mandiant report got released. You can go read that online if you want to. I felt like that the story that I posted in the article left a little bit to be desired in terms of giving you a lot of information, but according to Mandiant, it was very difficult to actually extract any information from this system. A lot of stuff had been wiped by the malware. Basically, the ultimate conclusion in this, the long-winded story here was hooking up third-party systems can be very dangerous, and even if you have a secure system on one end, hooking up something that's completely cooked up on the other end may lead to compromises in your supposedly secure system, and subsequently, you got all kinds of problems. They do say that they have put new systems in place that are going to detect, prevent, warn about these kind of breaches. But basically, at the end of the day, secrecy and shame have led to continued delays in releasing this report and giving any information on it. The money's long gone. Mandiant probably did all they could. I can't imagine them not doing that. And, so on. But at the end of the day, the attack used stolen credentials. And guess where you can get all of the stolen credentials you want, George? And I said that for a reason. So I really like this next story about passwords. I thought this was great. So these guys went out and they collected 1 billion credentials from the dark web. These were published credentials on the dark web, which had emails and passwords. And I don't know if they paid for them or how they didn't say how they got them. But basically, I always have some misgivings about collecting compromised data because it's compromised, which is kind of like basing your profile on serial killers, but only the ones you caught, which would be a profile of serial killers that are catchable, I guess. But in this case, this stuff was out on the dark web. It was probably not the fault of the password, even if it was horrible. Because these were usually compromised of large-scale data breaches. The 24 most common types of passwords were led with a number one category. The password was a name, and that name was George. No kidding. That was like 36% of the compromised passwords were names, and the most common name they used was George. I don't know why. The second category was a dictionary word, and the third was a key walk. And I'm going to actually give you the passwords in just a second. The password came in 11th on this, and an alphabet walk squeaked in there at 24th. But name was literally 37% of over 1 billion of the data set. So real quickly, the top passwords were George, a name. And these are in order from most common to least. Sunshine, which was a word category. ABCD1234 was the key walk password. Baseball was a sport. Dallas was a place. Tigger, a character. Monkey, an animal. Ginger, a food. I like ginger. The next category was an unknown weirdness. So this was like something that didn't make any sense, I guess. They didn't say what it was. Let me in topped the list of clever phrases. The word password, of course, being the top of the password variation category. Harley in the transportation category. You're going to like this next one. Jesus One, or it might be Jesus Uno, I don't know, was the head of the religious category. The word email was the head of the website-related category. I love you for emotional. Fuck me for the naughty category. Blink 182 for a band. Summer for a season. Purple was a color. Welcome in a form of greeting category. August for a month. Ranger, military reference. Gemini for astrology. And ABCD 1, 2, 3, 4 again at the top of their alphabet walk. Sad but true. But hey, even anonymized data is not really anonymous, right? So the next story, the anonymized data category, you're probably aware that anonymization exists. You may have gone on browsers to claim to be anonymized. 2 Harvard students recently built a tool that combs through large data sets, available again on the dark web, and obtained from breaches to link together data from one set to another set, which allowed them ultimately to de-anonymize it. So it's really like the idea big data has been all along. If you can collect enough data about everyone, you can probably tie those data sets together somehow, like, foreign keys in a table. And if you link them all together, ultimately what ends up happening with these data sets is that they were able to put back together in a pretty, they used the Experian leak, and then they looked at all the other data sets they could find to link pieces of the Experian data together, and they were able to actually key other data sets back into the Experience leak. They were finally able to produce 1,000 people in 10 seconds who fit a certain profile and tied all those back to breaches that revealed their names, their credit scores, pretty much everything about them. So statistics is true. And with enough breaches, you can probably piece together a whole profile of you and then sell that profile back in an almost legitimate fashion, maybe to somebody else, because there's really no provenance on this data. So this is what I would call a big data approach to breaching. And even your memory is not safe. I like this article about RAM attacks, and basically this tool, PCI Leech, if you've never seen it, it exploits DMA and other weaknesses, and it's pretty much as old as memory itself. The tool isn't, but the idea of exploiting memory. I remember long ago pulling passwords out of Windows, Microsoft memory when they were stored in plain text. This thing is PCI Leech pulls stuff out of the DMA. So these are chip-based, processor-based, et cetera, et cetera. Pretty much everybody has had hardware-based vulnerabilities. This tool can go in there and exploit this stuff and pull this down. Chipset vendors keep introducing fixes, but a lot of these fixes are not enabled. They may not be compatible with your hardware or your operating system, and they may not even then be effective at doing this. PCI Leech came out in 2016. It's able to insert kernel implants in, not everyone, but in certain kernels, which can allow you to do live RAM access, which is something some of us have been doing for a while. File system access even in some cases. And even beyond that, sometimes it's able to actually set the login password on the system or spawn a root shell down at the system level. So it's definitely a tool worth looking at in your lab. And with that, we'll take a short break and we'll be back with Jason Wood, who's going to comment on the evolution of cybersecurity in Iran. So stick around.
RSA offers business-driven security solutions that provide organizations with a unified approach to managing digital risk that hinges on integrated visibility, automated insights, and coordinated actions. RSA solutions are designed to effectively detect and respond to advanced attacks, manage user access control, and reduce business risk, fraud, and cybercrime. RSA protects millions of users around the world and helps more than 90% of the Fortune 500 companies thrive and continuously adapt to transformational change. For more information, visit securityweekly.com/RSA Security.
Welcome back to Security Weekly News. Now, welcoming Jason Wood for our expert commentary of the week. Jason, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Doug. As always, good to be here with you.
Hey, we love to see you. The highlight of my week.
You need a better week.
I know.
So in this article, this was actually, I was reading around on some phishing campaigns, things that are going on, and I ran into this article about the evolution of an Iranian tool set that is attributed to Helix Kitten, aka APT34, aka Oil Rig, depending on who you're talking to. The analysis was written by a company named Intezer, Intezer. I'm going to go with that pronunciation, and a campaign that they were doing some digging into that I thought was kind of interesting to read through because they discussed the evolution of particular tools that were used by this threat actor in this new campaign that is actually targeting a U.S. company that does a lot of business with the U.S. federal government, as well as state and local governments and some other businesses that I guess have some tie-ins to the federal government. Now, one of the services, the company's name is Westat, WeStat. Go with WeStat. And one of their services is to go through and check your employee satisfaction. How is everybody doing? Are they happy with their career, opportunities they have, stuff like that? And the threat group, in this case, Helix Kitten, decided, hey, let's take advantage of this particular service because it has a little bit of credibility here built into it already. And so they decided to send out a phish to employees of WeStat and their customers or potential customers that contained a survey within a spreadsheet, coincidentally named survey.xls. And when the users received it and they opened up the document, they get a blank Excel spreadsheet. And I'm guessing that they're getting prompted at this point to turn on macros by Excel. Once the user enables macros, the spreadsheet populates and shows up. and it actually looks pretty good. The branding looks nice, the spelling and grammar looks okay, and at least in the screenshots that I saw. And so there was nothing to raise an immediate alarm other than the macros thing. But when you look at the format of the spreadsheet, there was nothing there that made you think, wow, this looks really sketchy. In fact, WeStat sounded kind of annoyed about the way that they used their branding, because in a statement that they released, they said this was a result, and I quote, a bad actor stealing the WeStat brand name and logo, end quote. So basically, it was a good fish. Now, all of that sounds fairly normal and not terribly exciting, but let's get into some of the ways the malware worked and discuss how it has evolved over time. The basic compromise: user enables macros. They start to fill in their survey, and behind the scenes VBA code extracts a zip file, writes an exe to disk. In this case, it writes it to a path, if you're interested, for your environment: /users /username /vals VALS / and then the exe's name was client update.exe. It then creates a scheduled task to launch that payload 5 minutes later on, and then creates other scheduled tasks to execute the payload every time the user logs into the system. So there's their persistence mechanism. Scheduled tasks are still very popular for that. Certainly something that I see on a day-to-day basis. And what I thought was interesting about this idea, though, is obviously once the infection takes place, the file's written to disk, the defenders have 5 minutes to prevent that first execution from firing off. Kind of a tall order right there to detect and respond that quickly. Now, Intezer said that the malware that was deployed was a modified version of the tone-deaf malware, which apparently was first cited by FireEye in a report that they did on this malware several months back. And Intezer noticed there are a lot of similarities in this malware to tone deaf, so much so that they just called this just a modification of the previous version and have named it Tone Deaf 2.0. And they got into some comparisons in their blog post between the two versions that I thought were really interesting, the previous version and the current one. Now, Tone Deaf 2 is a backdoor that basically allows the operators to execute arbitrary shell commands on the infected host, and there aren't any predefined commands or actions that this payload is going to take place. Apparently, that is a change from the previous version, where it did have that type of functionality built into it. There also seems to be a mix of using HTTP and HTTPS for C2, where apparently before it was just HTTP. So they're moving to HTTPS for everything. I thought it was interesting that there was a mixture here, that they didn't just make the switch. But maybe they're in the process of moving to HTTPS only, and that'll obscure some of our information from the network intrusion side of things. The C2 then communicates back to a web server. In this case, I believe the domain name is manygoodnews.com. Talks back to the C2 and says an HTTP parameter named SER, and they set it to and then they set that value, or send a value to that parameter, which includes a 3-digit server ID and a 3-digit client ID. Now, Intezer thought that they saw some hints of some other functionality that could be in this malware, but they weren't able to get the right client ID, server ID match, so they weren't able to see what that was. They were just getting 403 errors in their interactions with the C2 infrastructure, which I thought was interesting. I wonder how they were obscuring where they were coming from and what they were doing. There does appear to be a fair bit of code reuse between the two versions of the malware. Intezer showed some screenshots of the previous code and the current code, and what you see are a lot of variable names that are identical, values that are assigned to them are identical, patterns, the way things look very similar, and in some instances it's just a straight copy paste into the next into the new version. They are actually identical in certain methods or functions. So this is one of the things that they use to try and to tie it back to the analysis done by FireEye where they named it as APT34 or Helix Kitten. And then Intezer said, well, because of this copying and reuse, they suspect that this is also APT34. They also noted that one change in the malware is they actually moved from a 32-bit payload to a 64-bit payload. So I thought that was kind of interesting. One thing that was funny was Intezer decided to go and view the HTTP C2 in a browser and see what that looked like. And it came up with the page didn't load correctly. Basically, the operators made some mistake in their HTML, and the style sheets didn't load up. And that's because they set the MIME type wrong. They set it to HTML instead of CSS, and the browser's like, yeah, no, I'm not loading that. So that was kind of amusing, but it was basically trying to a very broken looking docs.microsoft.com. Another sign, though, that all is not as it seems in this Excel spreadsheet. You've got a document being delivered to from a U.S. company to other U.S. organizations, and in the metadata of the Excel spreadsheet, the language assigned to it is Arabic, which is a little more unusual inside the U.S. So somebody needs to do a little metadata scrubbing, it sounds like, maybe to improve their payload, but I'm sure they'll get to that. Or maybe it works well enough that they don't care. Who knows?
They'll have a bug bounty.
Yeah, I mean, both of the they could talk to the Russian mob about doing a bug bounty on it, right?
Help site.
Both of these issues, though, would really only be visible to somebody who's looking at it and doing some analysis. Regular user isn't going to, of course, interact with the C2. They don't even know what's happening, and they're probably not going to look at metadata. They're just going to start filling in their spreadsheet. What are some of the lessons to take away from this? Well, one, I thought it was kind of interesting to see how they perform this evolution. They did a really good write-up on seeing, the previous version and the current version of the malware. So I thought this was a really good write-up, and it was good to see their way of going through and doing the work. We get a lot of reports of this type of stuff. Attributing different attacks and campaigns back to threat actors, and sometimes that's interesting. It's always, I guess, on an academic level, kind of interesting to me to see who's involved with it. But if I'm interested in trying to gauge where my security program needs to be, and I'm of interest to nation-state groups and stuff like that, to see, okay, this type of activity is tied back to these nation-states, allows me to at least gauge my defenses somewhat on, are they sufficient? Would I be able to detect this? One of the things Intezer made the comment was just these modifications that they made, even though it was very similar to the previous version of Tone Deaf, at least out of the gate, this was not detected by a number of tools out there for as a malicious payload. Another thing to consider, of course, is if you're receiving emails from WeStat with a spreadsheet. I don't know how WeStat does their employee surveys, but if you're getting sent a spreadsheet, you might want to not want to open that up right away. Could be a little bit dodgy. But I would recommend going ahead and taking a read at this, getting familiar with how they did their analysis. You may not agree with their conclusions or what have you, but I think it's always good for us to understand how the analysis is done. What techniques are they using as they're going through and performing their analysis and attribution to a particular threat actor? This gets trotted out there an awful lot. This was the Russians, this was the Chinese, the Iranians, or whoever. I think even if we're not doing threat analysis, it's good for us to become familiar with how they work. Gives us a level of confidence. If nothing else, we can go back and read the reports and decide how well did the researchers doing their homework on this, and how credible is this report. So go check it out. I've got the link here in the show notes to the original article. Definitely worth your time for a read.
Thank you, Jason. A very interesting story. I always like to see that when you get Arabic language spreadsheet type things and fill them out immediately and send them back in. But very cool.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's what I always do. Finally, in the category of 99 Luftballon Schadenfreude, I really like this story about the performance artist creating a fake traffic jam. Simon Weckert, a performance artist, took cell phones, 99 cell phones, mind you, and put them in a wagon and pulled them around Berlin. The phones showed 99 drivers traveling down the road at a very low rate of speed, I guess however fast he could walk. And basically, the wagon load of 99 phones caused Google Maps to report a traffic snarl on that street due to the slow-moving large number of vehicles. So maybe Nina was right, and 1980s music videos really are good for something. Thanks for joining us for this episode of Security Weekly News. Be sure and be on the lookout for the wrap-up show this Friday and for all the shows that we've got this week. We'll see you next time on Security Weekly News.